Hi guys, now today we're moving on to our second poem by Sylvia Plath entitled Child, so just a one-word title, and it is a tribute to her young son Nicholas. Now when she was writing this particular poem, remember she was living in London with her two children, Frida her daughter and Nicholas her son. So she was alone at that particular stage and she was living in a small apartment with her two children, and remember her circumstances were quite dire at that particular stage. So I did mention before that she didn't have a lot of money and she was desperately trying to make ends meet. She was caring for her two children all alone and she was trying to maintain some kind of routine then when it came to writing as well. She was kind of slipping more and more into a depressive state and she found it very difficult then, of course, to exist essentially. So when we're looking at this particular poem, Child, obviously the circumstances are very important, the context is very important. So remember that her daughter was born in 1960, so that's April 1960, and she's referenced in the poem. Nicholas then was also born in Devon, but in 1962. So that would be January 1962. And then December 1962, she and her children moved to London. So basically then in January 1963, Nicholas celebrated his first birthday, but by April the 11th, then 1963, Sylvia Plath was dead. So in a way then she's writing to honour her child and to celebrate the fact, of course, that his first birthday has arrived. But we also get a sense of her crippling depression in this particular poem. So if we think about the title itself, think of the title Child. It's not very affectionate or very warm or very loving. You might say it does suggest a sense of dislocation or a sense of distance as such between mother and son. And that might suggest the idea that she's trying to separate herself from her children because she's anticipating, of course, her own suicide. In a way, she feels kind of estranged from them. She wants to do her best by her children, but she feels, so, of course, as if she is failing her children. So we get a real sense of her anguish and her torment throughout the poem. Okay, she did write a poem in honour of Frida, her daughter, and that was called Morning Song. And if you think about it, Morning Song, of course, would suggest a sense of newness and a sense of harmony and a sense of celebration, whereas Child is rather flat, a little bit bland or banal as such when we really think about it. The word child might suggest, of course, that she's writing a universal poem, that it could be applied, of course, to all children or all parents, essentially, too, as well. Also, when I think of the word child, I get the sense of sort of an unformed person, a person who is yet to emerge, a person who is yet to discover his or her full potential. So the idea that he's not really a person in his own right, he's just simply a baby. He's still very much a child, still very much immature and unformed. So she may be suggesting that then by using this simple yet revealing title to the poem. So the poem itself is quite simple and quite straightforward. It's very short as well. And remember, this time she's using tercets instead of couplets. So remember that a tercet is a stanza or a verse that consists of 3 lines. So basically before that, of course, she tends to use quite a lot of couplets. Sometimes she uses tercets, sometimes she uses single lines, sometimes she uses quatrains as well. Here she's simply using tercets. And some people could say that it's quite symbolic, that it's kind of emphasizing then her smaller family unit. In essence, then Plath and her 2 children, and how isolated they are, of course, from the world and how she wants to protect them. So she may be alluding then, of course, to her own isolation and loneliness, where she has her 2 children, but she is without her husband, Ted Hughes. So she directly addresses Nicholas in this particular poem. And if you think about it, of course, his name, Nicholas, is never mentioned in the poem, but the name is quite symbolic and it's associated, of course, with winter as well. If you think of Nicholas, Saint Nicholas, associated, of course, with Christmas, and the idea then that he was born in January kind of makes perfect sense. So your clear eye is the one absolutely beautiful thing. So if we think about the word clear here, what she's trying to say, of course, is that at the age of 1, His eye is obviously perfect and pure. But by pure, of course, she doesn't simply just mean healthy or responsive. She means, of course, that the child is untainted and innocent. He's perfectly healthy, but he is also, of course, uncynical as such. Okay, so he welcomes the world. He's very positive and bubbly and outgoing. She might be suggesting his sense of curiosity, okay, that he's still intrigued by the world. And by the end of the poem, then, we see that she has a very gloomy response to the world, that she's kind of jaded and cynical and disillusioned herself. So she's referencing then his clear eye as something that is very bright and very vital. When he looks around him, he absorbs everything in the world. Everything is a source of fascination and wonder to a small child. It's almost like the entire world is his adventure playground, ready for him to explore. And I kind of emphasize the idea that children find very ordinary, mundane aspects of nature and life interesting or captivating as such. So your clear eye is the one absolutely beautiful thing. You notice how she uses the word beautiful here as such. She sees him as perfect, as pure. But think about it. The word that really stands out in the opening line is not necessarily clear, it's the word one. And one would suggest the only beautiful thing that she sees in the world around her. So everything else, of course, is bleak and dark and grim. And the only thing perhaps that brings her joy or even a scintilla of hope would be her son Nicholas, or perhaps would be her children in general. I want to fill it with colour and ducks, the zoo of the new. So this is her wish or her hope for him, of course. She wants to teach him. She wants to expose him to all we'd say, the world has to offer, the best of everything. So I want to fill it with colour and ducks. Remember, of course, we had colourless at the end of Poppies in July, and that would suggest a grey and dismal world. Here, of course, she wants the world to be full of colour, a riot of colour for her young son. And colour would suggest, of course, the sense perhaps of sparking his imagination, the idea of beauty and harmony, the idea perhaps of variety and diversity as well. So think about, we say something as simple as a colourful rainbow, or think about all the variegated colours, the various colours in a garden as well. So I want to fill it with colour and ducks, everything that is positive and happy and joyful and vital. If we think of the image of ducks, of course, constantly associated with childhood, we can think of the idea of a mother, father, parent perhaps bringing a child to feed the ducks in the park. How simple that is, and yet how warmly a child will actually respond to it. If you think about ducks associated with childhood, you could have the image of the rubber duck in the bath. So the idea of something that is routine, but also something that is playful, that brings the child great joy and happiness. If you think of ducks, perhaps it could be associated with anthropomorphic images. So maybe associated with cartoons, Donald Duck or Daffy Duck, for example, picture books, stories, bedtime stories. So there is, we'd say, a number. So there are a number of ideas and images then suggested by colour and ducks. And she's relating those back then to childhood and the idea then of instructing or teaching or entertaining her child, how she wants to give him, of course, a good start in life, and she has hopes for his future. So she used the metaphor then when she's describing the zoo of the new. Notice the use of internal rhyme as well, zoo and new. Obviously rhyme, and that would suggest a great sense of harmony and togetherness. She uses that quite a lot in her poetry. So the zoo of the new. If you think about a zoo, of course, it would suggest obviously somewhere her children love to go and explore, as a great sense of the exotic, of the adventurous, all the new animals, of course, and creatures that they can view. So that sense of satisfaction, joy then, that comes from learning or that comes from experiencing new ideas and all that nature has to offer. The zoo of the new, again, would suggest perhaps that everything is exotic and adventurous and different and special then to a child. Even a humble worm in a garden, of course, can be an endless source of fascination for a child, even a little flower. So it's reinforcing the idea then that the world becomes a zoo to the little boy. So using a very simple metaphor, but a very effective metaphor. And we'll see how she tends to use metaphors in this particular poem as opposed to similes in the previous poem. Okay, so the zoo, the new then, whose names you meditate. Now, meditate, of course, can mean to think or to contemplate. And this is the idea, of course, of kind of mulling over all the new words that he hears, or all the new words, of course, that he has to memorize and learn. Because to meditate, of course, can mean to repeat like a mantra, something over and over and over again. And that would suggest the idea then that with repeating something or with repetition, you tend to absorb then the word or the idea or the fact. So she teaches him new words and he simply repeats them and then he memorizes them. He knows them then. Okay. So here we have very specific plants and flowers. April snowdrop. So if you think about a snowdrop, of course, it looks fragile and very vulnerable. It's a small flower. It usually grows, actually, it's the first flower that sort of flourishes or blossoms in January, but it can essentially, of course, be associated with springtime. Okay, so kind of late winter, early spring. So April snowdrop here would suggest then the fact that it is small and fragile, but also a snowdrop is known because it can grow essentially, or it can blossom where there is ice and snow. It can be seen then as very hardy or very resilient. So we think of a snowdrop, of course, just a humble flower. It's very small. You might not even notice it, but it is resilient. You notice, of course, the white flower, the whiteness representing the idea of purity and innocence that we had, of course, suggested in the opening line. Your clear eye is the one absolutely beautiful thing. So April snowdrop could refer back to, of course, just children in general, or Nicholas himself. Or if we think about it, remember that Frida was born in April. So Frida might suggest, of course, or be suggested by the April snowdrop here. Because if you think about it, of course, she is older than her brother and perhaps a little bit steadier on her feet and a little bit more independent, we'd say, and therefore resilient than her 1-year-old brother. Okay, because at this stage, remember, she's almost 3. So April snowdrop, Indian pipe. Now, Indian pipe is a particular plant, a flowering plant that is native to America, and it doesn't have any chlorophyll, so everything is white. So that's why she's using the image of white or whiteness here to represent purity and innocence, to represent perfection as such, something that is untainted, something that is flawless. So if we think about it, the stalk is white, the leaves are white, the flower itself is white. So it's quite similar then, of course, to the image of the snowdrop flower then in the previous part of the line. And once more, just simply emphasizing all these positive characteristics and traits that we associate with the little boy or childhood in general. When you think of Indian pipe, of course, obviously it's a metaphor, comparing her young son to a flowering plant. It might suggest the idea, of course, of harmony as well. If you think about, we'd say, the Indian pipe, the peace pipe that would be passed around during, we'd say, the various meetings that would be held in lodges by Native Americans as well. So it might be an allusion to that particular image, if you think of Westerns and so on, where you'd see particular images like that quite frequently. Little stalk without wrinkle. And little stalk, of course, would suggest obviously how young he is and the fact that he is yet to grow and mature and develop. But also, of course, without wrinkle would suggest the smoothness and perfection of his skin in a very obvious way. But without wrinkle, of course, would suggest without blemish then, emphasizing a kind of sweet perfection that is suggested from the very beginning of the poem to the very end of the poem. Pool in which images should be grand and classical. So if you think of the pool here, of course, it is a metaphor again. So far we've had the zoo of the new, we've had April snowdrop, we've had Indian pipe, stalk without wrinkle, and now a pool. Notice once more the use of natural images and symbols. We had, of course, images that were quite similar when we looked at poppies in July. Okay, very different flower, of course, and symbolizing different ideas, very different ideas, and sort of themes and issues and so on. But she tends to use these natural images then to represent the very natural innocence and sweetness and beauty and perfection of her little son or young child. So, pool image images should be. Notice how she's using that particular tense. They ought to be. They should be grand and classical. So if you think about the image of a pool of water, then she uses that particular image, images of seas and waters and oceans throughout her poetry. It's the idea that he would reflect what is good and pure in this world, rather than the ugliness and the horror and the pain that she herself is experiencing. If you think also about the image of a pool, then the image of water associated with life itself, or the idea of cleanliness and hygiene, of purity again, or the idea of baptism, of course, in terms of sacramental images and language there too. So the idea that the pool then is associated with the innocence and the perfection of her child is reinforced by that particular metaphor then. So pool image images should be, they ought to be perfect. So grand and classical would suggest something superior or something sophisticated. If we think of classical here, it might suggest, of course, classical music. It might suggest art and painting and sculpture. It might suggest dance and drama. It might suggest great literature, poetry, okay, so fiction, short stories. Anything at all that she sees as, perhaps we'd say, superior then, relating back to the idea of education and sophistication. Once more, she wants the best for her child, the best that the natural world has to offer, and the best, of course, that a man-made world has to offer as well. So the idea, of course, that she wants him to be stimulated intellectually as well. Okay, so she wants the best for him in terms of education and imagination, in terms of creativity and artistry. And remember, of course, that he himself did go on to become a marine biologist. So think about the image of the sea, of course, looms large in his future. And then think about the image of the pool associated with that. It almost, in a way, symbolizes his future then, a reflection of who he's going to be. Now, if you think about it, there's a dark side to the image of the pool and reflection, because she hopes, of course, that Nicholas will not reflect her and her flaws, or will not reflect her father, perhaps, or maybe even Nicholas's father and her estranged husband, Ted Hughes. So she wants something better for him, a better life, better relationships, maybe even, she's saying, of course, better parents for him as well. So maybe she feels as if she has failed her son already. And think about it, this particular poem was composed only a couple of weeks before she died. So it's really emphasizing then how insecure and how anguished she feels. She feels like a failure, and she wants something better or someone better for her young son. So if we think about should be then, that's the key phrase then. What she wants and what he will have, she feels, can be two completely different things. So the last verse then, the last tercet of the poem, really emphasizes then her growing sense of anxiety and her growing sense of depression. So she says not, in other words, that she doesn't want this for her son. Not this troublous wringing of hands. Now, troublous is slightly old-fashioned or dated. We can use the word archaic that we had before. Troublous is just sort of an old-fashioned, we'd say, way of saying troubled. So, like I said before, she's very anxious and kind of determined, of course, that her son would have a better life, much better than she ever had, more opportunities or better opportunities. So not this troublous wringing of hands. If you think wringing, it literally means twisting or contorting. And that might suggest, of course, how anxious and agitated she actually feels in this world, how restless she feels, as if nothing is ever good enough for her, or if she, of course, or that she essentially is not good enough for him or for the world itself. So if we think about it, that is a strong visual image that she's using here to represent her own sense of suffering and torment. It's almost like she's in a kind of private hell, that she feels tortured, essentially. It reminds us a little bit of the poppies in July and comparing them to little hell flames then. She will never be at peace. She will never have that sense of satisfaction. So the last part then, the run-on line there, is emphasizing another metaphor, and she's comparing the world around her, or her world then, to a dark ceiling without a star. So think about it. She's not talking about a fresh, open, expansive blue sky here, which would suggest potential. It would suggest a future. It would suggest, of course, being able literally just to breathe fresh air. Here she feels very oppressed. It's a very claustrophobic image. And the dark ceiling, of course, is almost like a night sky, essentially. And think about it, without a star, because the star could represent hope and brightness, a future. If you think about it, of course, stars have been used then to represent love. We think moonlight and stars. Or if we think of the idea of a guiding star guiding you to safety, but she feels adrift, she feels all alone. And the star is used, of course, obviously, in religious imagery as well. It's used in the Bible. If you think of the idea of the star guiding the three wise men, essentially, to the baby Jesus. So this is the notion, of course, that everything just feels black and overwhelming, and she is just simply suffering in silence, that she has no one to turn to. And obviously she cannot tell her children, she cannot express how she feels to her children. So it's just that sense of loneliness and isolation, that she's cut off from everyone and everything, and she just feels that sense of abandonment at the very end of the poem, because it really emphasizes how cynical she has become around, we'd say, about the world around her, that she is disenchanted or disillusioned then with the world. So simply the world has been reduced then to something small and suffocating, this dark ceiling without a star. So remember I was saying before that some people would regard this as sort of like a suicide note, essentially, because it was her final poem, the poem that she composed then towards the end of January. So it was written towards the end of January, and then she died on the 11th of February. And remember, of course, then sadly, Nicholas himself took his own life then at the age of 47, and that was in 2009. So remember that you need to focus on both of those particular poems. Go over and revise the theme of the poem. Okay, so the idea of what the poem is about. Are you able to write a paragraph on that? Okay, so the idea is expressed in the poem. And can you identify 2 or 3 aspects of style or techniques in the poem? So think about it. The first one would be the title of the poem. Why does she use that title? What does it represent? The second one then perhaps could be the use of tercets in the poem, the 3 lines. Do they symbolize something or someone? The next feature or aspect of style then could be your metaphors. So you kind of group them together. So she tends to use metaphors then when describing or outlining then certain characteristics or features of her young son Nicholas. What are they? What do they represent? You could look at something simple then like the natural images. You want to put symbols, metaphors, natural images all together as one. You could look at some of the sound effects. Remember, we're looking at the rhyme and the repetition in Zoo of the New, essentially there as well. She tends to use a little bit of alliteration in the sibilant S sound as well. So if you think about it, a ceiling without a star, that's quite sinister or ominous then towards the end of the poem. Okay, so just make sure that you keep on practicing those particular paragraphs. And remember, the next day then we'll move on to Elizabeth Bishop and the first poem. So see you tomorrow, guys. Bye.